From the youngest genin to the Hokage, Kakashi's power has always been a discussion that's been vehemently disputed since his first appearance over 25 years ago. Even till now, just how strong is Kakashi? Well, let's find out. Shooting for 20k, let's go. Closing in on Konoha's now darkest hour, the village has been largely damaged. The Hokage was killed, and now an S-rank criminal organization is taking up their arms against the village. Tsunade returns. A Hokage is now here, and as she begins to examine many of the injured characters like Lee and Sasuke, she comes around to Kakashi and states, "Getting beat by just a couple of thugs? Guess you were human after all. I thought you were a natural." As if to say that from the last time she had seen Kakashi, being when he was surely under 10 years old, she would have had assumed that his power must have continued at the rate at which it once did, where Itachi, who from her knowledge slaughtered the strongest clan in Konoha alone in a single night, was merely a thug to who she perceived Kakashi to be. And why is this? How strong was Kakashi as a kid? Well, after having been promoted to Genin, Chunin, and even Jonin at the youngest ages in history, Kakashi, speaking to the precocious genius of himself according to Fanbook 1, was obviously, as his birthday column states, quote, one of the foremost shinobi in Konoha, with each of those ranks being explained by Fanbook 1 to be, quote, ones given out based on raw strength and capability. The age at which Kakashi took on his Jonin role primarily comes from the notion that both he and Obito didn't just graduate together, but also took the Chunin exams together, despite the fact that Obito in every databook except for databook 4, which already has time conundrums as it is 4 years older than Kakashi. Obito is stated to be 13 during the events of Operation Kanami Bridge, and according to the 10th Mini Chronicle Guide and 1 Decade 100 Ninja Guide, and even Minato, by that mission, Kakashi couldn't have been promoted to Jonin at no older than 10 years old. This is something my friend Sage has gone over on his channel, so check him out, as he's also helped with some of the research for this video. Therefore, Kakashi at the ripe age of 9 would have, quote, reached the peak of shinobi forces, where the purpose is now to primarily demonstrate their incredible skills on the front lines, according to the aforementioned fanbook, which also underwrites the idea that Kakashi, quote, has fought through many harrowing battles and faced death countless times, according to both that first fanbook and Kizuna Heaven Scroll guidebook. During Kakashi Gaiden, over 10 years ago, amid constant skirmishes along the border of each nation, Kakashi found himself in constant battle with Iwagakure shinobi, where we see that Kako, one of the most powerful shinobi in all of Iwagakure, who excels in not just the 3 main jutsu categories but is overwhelmingly confident in close quarters combat, is now engaging the young Kakashi. He uses his Assassin's Creed style twin blades and clashes several times with Kakashi's single kunai. The two then engage further after Kakashi has been fighting and lost his dear friend, where Kakashi is literally stunting on him, ultimately one-shotting him with the Chidori in that specialized close quarters combat range. This is all speaking to the ability that Kakashi's developing according to his renowned talent, which Databook 4 corroborates in Rin's file that he was blessed with magnificent talent even in the backdrop of basically every shinobi in the series. And it would be during this very mission where Kakashi's power would be recognized as the very thing that deteriorated his body and soul. Around 5 years prior to this, Sakumo Hatake was revered by everyone, whose power according to both Minato and the 4 databooks surpassed the might of all 3 Sannin combined. Ultimately though, he took his own life, for the weight and burden of choosing his friends over the mission was too heavy. Kakashi spites those who choose their friends over the mission. He always listens to the rules. He spites his own friend, because that decision took away the life he could have had. However, Obito's words of those who break the rules are scum, but those who abandon their friends are even worse than scum, ignites something in Kakashi to realize why his father did that, and he turns around and saves Obito just in the nick of time, wherein Taiseki, the other Iwa-nin, posits the possibility of Kakashi being the White Fang. And while of course he isn't of the level of his father and who he once was, it does speak to the level of Kakashi and now how his opponents actually view him, in combat on the battlefield through the reputations and backdrop of comparisons like Sakumo and the Sannin, who are stated to make Ghost flee on sight in Databook 2. Furthermore, it's also pretty crucial to note a few other things before discussing and digressing elsewhere. The first of which is to note that in furthering Kakashi's high Jonin and monstrous level, Team Minato isn't an ordinary cell, as though it appears and is hailed in Databook 2 to be a small elite squad, where a special mission was assigned to the 4-man cell, 2 Jonin including the Yellow Flash, and 2 Chunin, which also confirms Rin to be a Chunin likely capable of beating most of the powerful Genin from the Part 1 exams. Maybe Rin was stunting on Neji or Gaara or something, I don't know. Kakashi also then grows from these feats and being one of those foremost shinobi in Konoha, gaining 3 more years of both fighting and training with anime guidebooks like the 1 Decade 100 Ninja Guide and other guidebooks remarking that he trains every single day. Something to continue noting for later. If you're open to granting some canonical charity and wiggle room, then we could also supplement his foremost role through how the Naruto Storm 4 cutscenes actually show Kakashi being able to press a Jonin Minato onto the back foot, clashing multiple times and even using clones and an attempt at Chidori before Minato shuts this down, while also granting Kakashi the compliment of, "I'd already consider you Jonin class." This tells us that if you are to accept it, while Kakashi isn't a Jonin by this point, he was promoted to Jonin for power reasons as opposed to anything else. Although, in fairness, you could derive this from the manga and Fanbook 1's remarks about how one is promoted to Jonin level anyway, as we kind of hinted at prior. And lastly, Kakashi's jutsu mastery by this point is very telling, with him having at least both the Rasengan and Chidori, which in Sasuke's case can clash with Konoha's treasured Blade of Thunder God once wielded by the second Hokage, plus some other more basic jutsu. Later, Kakashi states that most Jonin have at least 2 natures, and who's a better reference than himself? I'm kidding. That was a joke because Kakashi isn't the average Jonin that people think, and if you want to discuss just Jonin Kakashi, then Kid Kakashi is probably the most accurate metric to do so. Regardless, for Kakashi, just as Databook 2 states, this time in his life was one where shinobi lives are fleeting as stardust, but perhaps in his heart, his best friend shined as stardust as well. With a new eye glowing, Kakashi of the Sharingan is now here. And just as Databook 4 says, with thoughts of his friend in his heart, he lives on as an ANBU. For the boy who not only lost everyone, but learned too young that a shinobi's enemy wasn't the one who often stood in front of him, but the choices that followed him after. And Kakashi's darkness is going to begin punctuating each aspect of his life. And from this point forward, Kakashi will begin to truly take on the role Kakashi of the Sharingan. In playing off the exact statement from the last section, Kakashi is appointed to ANBU Black Ops upon Minato's recommendation and serves as Kushina's bodyguard at some point. He couldn't have been in the ANBU for more than 2 years, seeing as his birthday's in September, Kushina dies in October, and he's only 14 for like a month. Fanbook 1, likely in accordance to Kakashi having some of the most completed missions in all of the first Databook, states he seems to have carried out many missions for the ANBU, but there's no records containing any details. However, Databook 3 perhaps gives us some insight in that Kakashi was a legend born among the ANBU, who are a group that also are only chosen among the most elite shinobi, also furthering Kid Kakashi's power as a foremost Jonin, where in joining the ANBU, he isn't just a legend among them, but they are also called shinobi among shinobi, hence why Kakashi's name is said to echo across the shinobi world in Databook 4. The specifics of that which Kakashi ever did, however, are exactly as said, unknown. We legitimately know close to nothing about what he did specifically, but more so general implications surrounding his power or possible things that you can point to. One of the which can come from Itachi's Shinden, wherein several years ago, Itachi, in trying to realize his future and accepting the greatest mission up until that point, his heart was pounding. He was nervous beyond all description, and just after he'd finally decided on having Shisui as his partner for said mission, we cut to a man smoking a cigarette in one hand with a bottle of sake in the other. His name was Mukai Kohinata. I know, look, nobody knows him, but he's a man skilled enough to be promoted to ANBU around the same time as Jonin, wherein his dual-class missions and proficiency seemed to later catch the attention of Hiruzen, who would begin directly assigning Mukai missions. Mukai was masterfully skilled. He had, by virtue of being an off-branch Hyuga, the Byakugan in one eye and its correlating abilities like both Gentle Fist and the 8 trigrams. However, now, as the cigarette smoke blows in his face, Itachi is now here to assassinate Mukai for being a Kirigakure spy for financial reasons. This takes place around a year and a half prior to the Uchiha massacre, so Itachi's power isn't one to be joked about and isn't even really a kid, Itachi anymore. He's kind of who you're thinking about almost during the massacre, and Shisui's reputation is already at its known notoriety, with Mukai even saying as much. The two are hailed even by Danzo at this point to be the strongest force in the Uchiha clan and could likely take down anyone in the clan, which is called the strongest clan in Konoha in the third anime profile guides, and yet despite this, Mukai manages to 2v1 stomp both Shisui and Itachi, immobilizing Itachi via Gentle Fist and Shisui via Strangulation. This forced Shisui to realize their grave situation and activate his Mangekyo, and ultimately win the fight via that way. And thus, perhaps Kakashi should be above all of this through scaling above Mukai, and thus characters like the 4th Hokage candidate Fugaku, the Wicked Eye. Him scaling above Mukai via ANBU ranking is also just consistent with the idea of Kakashi resisting Obito's Genjutsu when Mukai couldn't do so. So, Kakashi during the ANBU is firmly beyond Kage tier fighters and also has vastly an increased arsenal from his childhood days. We know he gains access to his ninja dogs, capable of piercing and restraining Zabuza during this time, along with a few other things. Kakashi's power during this time is pretty ambiguous though, although there are a few more notes that I want to touch on in the next section as they're going to become kind of apparent for some possible implications of a version of Kakashi that ANBU Kakashi is above. After nervously waiting to meet their new sensei, their initial impressions are horrible. Kakashi shows up late. A common theme to come for the ache of his friend's absence still draws him to the graveyard. Kakashi has, as we know, lost virtually everyone in his life and now talks at the grave for hours and hours on end. And we know this because Fanbook 1 actually shows how many hours Kakashi was late, and I don't know how this dude wasn't fired, put on the night shift toilet cleaner, because my boy was hours late like every time. In their introduction, the first anime profile guide states that basically what we all know. Kakashi's true strength is overwhelming, but even more importantly that Sasuke's abilities have surpassed the Genin level and anyone would respect the #1 rookie in Konoha, and yet here's Kakashi completely parrying him off without much thought, blocking multiple kicks and strikes at the same time, only mentally engaging the scenario when Sasuke tags the bell, and even more so when Sasuke utilizes the fireball, which just happens to shock Kakashi. Kakashi and Ko then begin to embark on high-level missions, but this firstly leads me into something more crucial, and this also helps innately speak to the ANBU Kakashi's power level that I previously mentioned, as Databook 1 calls Kakashi the strongest ninja, both Databook 3 and Might Guy call him Konoha's top jutsu master. Fanbook 1 says he's not only among the most powerful shinobi in Konoha, but also is balancing his role as top Jonin. The first anime profile guide states that he's the #1 artisan of a Hidden Leaf village. His name is famous across nations. Databook 2 states that, quote, among the Jonin, Kakashi's speed ranks at the very top. Databook 3 calls him Konohagakure's #1 ninja. Look, you get the point. Kakashi is, bar none, the strongest Jonin in Konoha, where even other Jonin like Asuma are hailed in Databook 2 to simply be close to Kakashi at their true strength, which is just means like their peak, which is just seemingly suggesting that Kakashi is the true peak benchmark for even the Jonin class. Furthermore, Kakashi is a means to show a perfectly well-rounded Jonin, and allow me to explain. In Databook 2, Asuma, in his true strength, that being close quarters combat, is close to Kakashi. He exceeded in CQC. Kurenai stated in the 10th anniversary guidebook for the anime to be a master of high-level jutsu. Kurenai is one of the Hidden Leaf's most skilled illusionists, and she specializes in Genjutsu. Might Guy obviously specializes in Taijutsu, and Kakashi is relative to or above all of their peak abilities, which suggests a narrative for what kind of Jonin Kakashi is to represent. During the Land of Waves, the deadly mist assassin Zabuzawa Mochi, one of the 7 ninja swordsmen, reflects on his past when he was in bed with Kirigakure's government and says he had a bingo book where Kakashi's name was extensively written as one with the most utmost concern, also listing his impressive combat records. Kakashi unveiled his Sharingan in both the first and second encounter. Kakashi battles relatively with the silent killer, and as the series begins to ramp up and progress in terms of power, I want to flesh out 2 real metrics to suggest why we can be certain that Kakashi is growing in power, despite popular belief about his supposed stagnant power. The first of which would be through his early comparisons to Kabuto Yakushi, Orochimaru's assassin, where we see that Kabuto was not only impressing and arguably rivaling Kakashi when preying upon Sasuke, and while both Sanin and Kakashi himself alike agree with the notion of Kabuto being relative to Kakashi, the aforementioned 10th anniversary guidebook actually remarks that Kabuto is said to possess skills equal to those of Kakashi, even much later into the series, with this guide in particular being a 10-year anniversary release, meaning it's covering to the Akatsuki suppression area for the anime, being around chapter 330 in the manga, with 10th anniversary guides for the manga, like the 10th Minute Chronicle guidebook covering to chapter 457 or the opening of the Kage Summit, confirming that Kabuto is a fighter equal to or on par with Kakashi, with the latter being a retrospective statement about part 1. The former of which, though, could be implied to concern Kabuto's amplifying himself with Orochimaru's chakra, and thus is also still keeping up with the Kakashi who, quote, trains every day, as we said we come back to. So, yeah. Whereas, as the series is progressing, this notion tends to kind of wear off, at least from its prominence that it once had in part 1. Of course, an even better metric, though, to argue for Kakashi's growth through the series would be through his Sharingan usage. In the Land of Waves, the Sharingan alone would tax Kakashi noticeably. His Raikiri was a technique that he could really only use 4 times a day, whereas later, after realizing the threat of Orochimaru and Kabuto, he begins training and immediately understands just how much weaker he'd let his body become over the years, directly implying that Kakashi, despite being the peak Jonin, is implying that the part 1 version of himself isn't of the level of his ANBU counterpart, which we kind of already gathered, and this should just be pretty solid stock for ANBU Kakashi. This fits with a very similar sentiment of Kakashi perhaps not realizing his physical decay until this point, as for example, in Data Book 1, Kishimoto has a special interview concerning Kakashi, wherein when asked, quote, if Kakashi is always a fast eater, Kishimoto simply responds via stating, I think he is. A Jonin must never let his guard down, even during a meal. I mean, that's basic, so yes, quick meals are his specialty, end quote. Which seemingly implies that Kakashi is ready for a fight and isn't actively disengaging, but is more so subconsciously really bored of shinobi life. Following the time skip, Kakashi has gotten noticeably stronger, where now he can use 5 Raikiri while constantly using the Sharingan and even coupling water walls and constant taijutsu bouts into it against 2 opponents who are stated to be capable of taking down a Jinchuriki or 1,000 men at once. Kakuzu can utilize jutsu that are compared to a natural disaster, which Kakashi tanks, and Hidan is called a Shinigami of Death and is one of the only characters besides Pain to be called invincible in Data Book 3. This is all while he is not only burdening himself with having to protect Team 10, but is also confident in using Kamui as a last resort to kill Kakuzu. This being the same duo who each individually were conceded by Asuma to be far out of his league before they ultimately killed him. And while some will argue for Kakashi somehow being more unimpressive due to Naruto being a supposed equal to him, this doesn't really impede anything except for Naruto simply getting that much stronger. Once both he and Sakura had returned to the bell test in the beginning of Shippuden, we still see that Kakashi's sign weaving skills were vastly superior to both Naruto and Sakura, and the only real change is just what Naruto's birthday column notes. Naruto and Sakura are now of a level where they are closer to comrades with Kakashi than merely students. In the aforementioned Akatsuki suppression arc, Naruto can now one-shot 2 of Kakuzu's lives in a single attack, and has jutsu that not even the 4th Hokage could master. So, Kakashi's concessions of Naruto being a superior aren't even that bad, and as Kakashi's power continues to grow, he will surpass this form of Naruto anyhow. With that though, it's actually pretty safe to assume that Kakashi could still beat this Naruto even with the Rasen Shuriken. Why do I say this? Well, Kakashi, after having returned from the time scoop, had reawakened an ability once gained when unknowingly reunited with his once dear friend, if we even ought to call him a friend by this point. And as Kakashi unveils his new Sharingan, he reveals the Kamui, which allows for him to literally, quote, change the dimension of the visible world and wrinkle space itself, according to Data Book 3, prompting Deidara to call it Itachi-level ocular jutsu as it warps his literal arm off, where Kakashi tried it a second time, ultimately draining himself, with the third data book implying that it endangers his life. This ability would have allowed Kakashi to kill Kakuzu, as he notes, and this could solve the riddle of how he would have beaten most elite shinobi by this point. Sakura can rival Sasori with even his third Kazekage puppets and the Iron Sand, the most feared weapon in all of Tsunegakure, which made the third the strongest shinobi, and I quote, reacting to it and even evading several attacks. And going back to part 1, Kisame isn't off the hook either, and Itachi told him that fighting Kakashi isn't an easy fight by any means, so within the confines of the Akatsuki suppression arc, it's pretty clear that Kakashi is no longer just the strongest Jonin, but far more, either exceeding or rivaling basically the entire bottom half of the Akatsuki. He even fights and arguably beats a 30% clone of Itachi, or would at least scale above the Naruto who did. Prior to moving into the pain battle, we do see that Kakashi later utilizes his ninja hounds once again for tracking purposes, which later continues just how diverse his arsenal actually is. The copy ninja has used demonic illusion, sealing ninjutsu, tracking hounds listed alongside Sannin summons in anime guidebooks, MS techniques, dual S rank techniques. I mean, what else can we really say? Like, who are we gonna talk this kind of like jutsu talk about? You know what I mean? Like, nobody else is really matching this sort of praise. Now, as Divine Wrath is due to pour out all over Konoha, Kakashi immediately catches on to Pain's Hunter and Havoc strategy, instantly catching the black belted blades and fighting Pain for the next few chapters. He immediately uses a mud wall behind Pain to prevent a backward evasion and uses a Raikiri, although is stabbed, which disrupts his chakra. In the anime, when he grabs the rod, he actually snaps it, which would put Kakashi into the tier of Sage Naruto, Sage Jiraiya, Pain, and a later Four Tails Naruto, who of the which is above the same Three Tails Naruto stated in anime guidebooks to threaten the entire planet, although the manga doesn't seem to agree with this possibility, showing Kakashi openly conceding to the impressive nature of Jiraiya taking on all 6 paths at the same time, which he actually did at the end of the fight, contrary to popular belief, and this may actually stand as a narrative point for Kakashi, since just prior to Jiraiya heading off to this final resting spot, he and Tsunade discussed Kakashi being able to take up the role of Hokage, which he could through power, but simply lacks experience. Furthermore, in Fanbook 1, we also directly know that Kishimoto answers the question of who should be 5th Hokage with Kakashi Hatake. Yeah, Kakashi has certainly qualified, which implies that prior to Hiruzen vs Orochimaru, Kakashi was perceived by Kishimoto to be a possible and likely 5th Hokage, and Tsunade is in this fanbook, albeit barely, but this statement could be presuming that Hiruzen is going to live longer and Kakashi could thus get more experience, or perhaps Kakashi is the best choice aside from the Sannin. Either way, I digress, take it as you will, but it is a pretty good statement. Kakashi then uses a second Raikiri, but is countered via Shenra Tensei. Kakashi then uses an ability that has overwhelming effectiveness when used on enemies for the first time, that being his Sure Kill ninjutsu in the Lightning Beast Tracking Fang, which is stated in Data Book 4 to be a shape transformation of the Raikiri with tracking abilities and a very unique set of traits to increase its efficacy. Although, to no avail, it's repelled again, and as the Ashura path joins in, Kakashi uses a 4th Raikiri, actually aimed to swipe off his head, but it was evaded through the shared vision, which Kakashi couldn't have really accounted for. His lightning clone is then stabbed, which allowed Choji and Choza to slam and squash the Ashura path like a bug, whereafter Kakashi does remark that he used up over half of his chakra, relying now on a smoke bomb attack, which was actually used to hide a chain that was disguised as Kakashi trying to stab Pain. where then the human boulder rolls in and nearly catches the Diva Path, but the Ashura Path comes out of the pit of hell to tank another Raikiri, making this the 5th Raikiri, leaving him basically pinned for dead. And to save Choji's life, Kakashi gave his own, and used Kamui on top of all of that, draining himself beyond repair. For Kakashi, protecting others wasn't his mission to those surrounding him, but to those he failed to protect all those years ago. And now, he's simply exhausted. He was exhausted like his father was when Kakashi began to watch him fade away, when he watched him cut his hair, when he watched his eyebrows grow more than his reputation. Kakashi was tired, and not because of the Sharingan, but because of the graveyard of ghosts that he once called comrades, staring back at him through the Sharingan. And now, as his head hangs to rest, Kakashi Hatake is now dead. And as Kakashi walks through limbo, a faint light appears. A campfire, hindered by a familiar figure, who calls out to Kakashi. Our dear sensei sits and joins his father to tell him his tale. After Kakashi is being revived from the grave, he begins to rampage onto the battlefield with the strength of 1,000 shinobi. There is a notable power difference that most people also argue is just a matter of power cliffing. However, this doesn't really seem to be the case. In fact, we actually have a pretty good basis to suggest that Kakashi, having reunited with his father, changed something fundamental about Kakashi. It released a burden off Kakashi. The birthday column even confirms that Kakashi tells his father he's proud of him. He's proud of the decision that he made to die, and ultimately ended up forgiving his father in that moment. This is why even going into the war arc, both Guy and Lee are completely intercepting Haku and kicking him, and Kakashi is basically just Raikiri Zabuza's chest off rip, where he then goes on to fight the rest of these 7 ninja swordsmen for give or take 20 chapters, where we did see a glimpse of the battle where Kakashi and Guy are perked up against one another back to back, with Kakashi's Sharingan eye closed, which either speaks to his fatigue or looming superiority to the swordsman, wherein I think the latter is more likely, if not both being relatively true simultaneously. However, after the conclusion of that battle, and just as Naruto's arduous battle with the Jinchuriki rages on, he's pinned down to the ground. Kakashi and Guy rush in, with Guy in particular using his destructive spinning kick that surpasses even Guy and Lee's previous combo, ultimately bulwarking Obito's onslaught, where the two then split up to fight the Jinchuriki, who were transformed into their version 2 states that could previously press both KCM1 and B. The former is now considered to be even stronger than when he fought Pain, hence to why he can keep up with Itachi Uchiha, and is now a fighter who is just like the Yellow Flash, according to both Tsunade and Killer B. Naruto by this point could even keep up with the 4th Raikage A, who calls himself the fastest shinobi alive since the 4th Hokage, and yet Naruto blitzes him, and he and B go on to be called the strongest fighters on the Allies' side of the war. However, despite those accolades, Kakashi can not just fight equally to the same guy who is 1v1ing the Six Tails, repelling its corrosive acid fog and preparing a further fight against the full transformation, but also fight against several V2 Jinchuriki at the same exact time, while worried about his chakra supply. Kakashi lightning cables the V2 chakra arms and then states the next wave is coming, wherein, cutting over to Guy, we see in the background that Kakashi is facing off against 4 V2 Jinchuriki at the exact same time, of the which is the Seven Tails, who can actually fly, which is pretty saucy as a side note. Even after fighting relatively to that fighting force, he and Guy reunite, and all 5 of the remaining V2 Jinchuriki transform into their full power complete states and simultaneously form a Bijou Bomb, which Kakashi is confident in matching through his Kamui and Guy through the 8th gate. Before digressing though, I want to discuss 2 primary points for Kakashi that are rather subtle. That being, the first of the which is how he relates to Guy. We see Guy facing off against a Bijou breaking the Coral Jutsu that KCM1 Naruto's chakra arms couldn't, and Kakashi and Guy are completely relative in base, reacting to the corrosive acid at the same time, reacting to the V2 arms at the same time, and even having pretty similar performances overall. The 6th gate and Raikiri Kakashi then both get a substantial amp and are virtually equals again, running at the exact same speed, attacking at the same speed, fighting opponents in a similar manner, concerning the speed thereof. But then, this actually gets a bit more intricate, because then, at the two's pinnacle ability in both Kamui and the 8th gate are also compared here, but both being abilities that would likely wipe out the lives of both of them, but could stop the Bijou Bomb. 102 chapters later, however, while Guy is finally giving his life for the sake of the generation to come, Kakashi's Kamui can intercept Guy's movement speed, showing the same possible relativity here. I mean, both are bending space. Okay, I'm kidding. And now, while sure, Kakashi does concede to Guy being stronger after reminiscing with some moments from his childhood with his father, he also considered that Rasen Shuriken Naruto was stronger while simultaneously excluding the Kamui from those sorts of statements. But my claim inherently isn't that Kakashi's Kamui is faster than the 8th gate, but more so that it's a relative ability to the 8th gate, both spatial warping abilities, and it's at least a relative ability on a low end. However, this would lastly imply that Kakashi would match the 7th gate with all of his jutsu as opposed to just the Raikiri, although this is a bit more intricate. But anyway, you could at least get some relativity in that, Kakashi could basically do what Guy can do throughout the war at any point prior. Furthermore, in Data Book 1, we do also know that for those who outright doubt this notion, Kishimoto confirms the two to be rivals, although while also applying some skepticism to Guy's 30-0 record against Kakashi. Regardless, if you are to take this leading into my second point, you have a pretty compelling case for why Kakashi would clearly be stronger than the last remaining Akatsuki member that Guy basically dominated, Kisame, who could not just break Yamato's concentrated wood style that could hold down the Four Tails, a Sannin level threat that brought Jiraiya to the brink of death and forced Sika Orochimaru to retreat, but also fight a 3 Tomoe Itachi pretty handily, which of course would be gathered regardless, considering how, Kakashi is above the same KCM1 Naruto that did just do that. Point being is that Kakashi is no longer some Jonin who's sub-Sannin, losing to Itachi left and right, barely beating Akatsuki members, always fatigued, you name it, but is now clearly a true war arc combatant, who is far and above most of the entire Akatsuki and has the same stated acolytes of the Akatsuki, namely being above 1,000 shinobi at once and beating both Bijou and Jinchuriki. Previously in the last arc, we also saw that Kakashi, while overcome by darkness once again when reuniting with his lost student, Sasuke, Data Book 4 doesn't just state this, but Kakashi himself even states that he finally understood what the third Hokage felt all those years ago. In the words of the Kizuna Earth Scroll, quote, Sakura resolves to kill Sasuke with her own hands. But just before she can carry out her decision, Kakashi takes that burden onto himself. His regret over failing to stop his student from being consumed by revenge, and the compassion he cannot extinguish even though Sasuke now turns his murderous intent towards him, Kakashi accepts all of that pain and turns his blade towards Sasuke. End quote. Minato, when fighting his student, was in a near unconscious state of shock. Hiruzen can barely fight, and Kakashi should be given the same understanding here. And yet, despite Sasuke completely beating around all 5 Kage, with the Sasuke he's now fighting being stated to be unrecognizably more powerful, further alluding to this. On top of comboing away the Susanoo arrow, both he and Sasuke release ninjutsu at one another off screen according to the birthday column. And lastly, Data Book 4 puts nails in the coffin of not just calling Kakashi first class among teachers, but also a peerless or uncommon shinobi who unleashes divine lightning, which is a sacred treasure of the village, something similar to the reputed blade of that of the second Hokage, Tobirama's Blade of Thunder God, which I made a comparison of earlier. And this shouldn't sound surprising, as Kakashi here is stated to be recommended for the title of Hokage, implying that he's now gone beyond the 5 Kage level, and even has the guidance and the experience to take up such a role now, which he didn't have prior. I digress. Just keep Kakashi's above the Gokage, Akatsuki, KCM1 level notions going forward, as it should be pretty clear he's a top tier fighter, or as Data Book 4 says, a peerless shinobi. However, I'll tie this specific point back in later, and also subscribe, or don't, I guess. Just like the video if you've enjoyed, or if you learned something, I don't know, it'd be greatly appreciated. You can hype the video so more people can see it, but regardless. As the fight resumes a couple dozen chapters later, but this time the engagement is no longer centered around the Jinchuriki, but White Mask Obito himself, who by this point is really just a war boss said to be just like Madara in that each of their powers are overwhelmingly above the rest of the world, The two have fire style that move equally and both speeds in the Bomb Blast Dance and Majestic Destroyer Flame, wherein Obito matches Madara from a farther distance. Their MS projectiles with both Kamui and the Susanoo move at the exact same speed, and they jump and land on the Ten Tails at the same speed, and fight relatively to Naruto at the same speed, this alluding to the ultimate idea that Edo Madara and White Mask Obito are highly relative combatants, and thus Obito could probably beat the 5 Kage, which should speak to who Kakashi, Guy, and Naruto are really fighting here. Naruto and his clone then engage the far superior Obito, wherein Obito passes through the clone, pops him with the Uchiha Reflection Blade, then prepares to kill Naruto. Guy then flies in from the top, forcing Obito to halt with his nunchucks, which he further utilizes to block several kunai from Obito. Pretty telling, since Kakashi is a rival to this very guy, who is further engaging Obito far better than KCM1 Naruto ever was, even with his chakra arms, which corroborates the notions of both he and Kakashi's looming superiority to this very Naruto. And look bro, Naruto is getting phased through and stomped, and Guy is over here blocking the Uchiha Reflection Blade from behind the back with his nunchucks, which even in the following scene does outspeed KCM1 Naruto once again, and follows up with, "He's so strong, I can't even get a single attack in." Kakashi can also Kamui the kunai between both Naruto and Obito. However, as Guy begins to further explain the plans on how they ought to assist KCM2 Naruto, Kakashi is completely out of it, sweating and reminiscing on the grave he once thought was dedicated to his dead friend. Guy demands that he shouldn't wallow in sentimentality, yet Kakashi is dazed, having the same ellipses as Minato did when he was said to have his soul basically leave his body from his stupor, with the back of volume 64 stating that his resolve was shaken by the fact that the masked man was his former comrade. However, as Guy continues to press on, Kakashi's conviction has returned, while also noting that he has a few shots left of Kamui, which is actually pretty crazy all things considered. He then uses said Kamui to completely blitz White Mask Obito via Kamui not just the Rasengan, but the entire Naruto clone without Obito really even noticing. Kakashi then engages Obito while comboing with Naruto, and also peep this massive Hirudora from Guy, so good stock for Kakashi being his rival. But to tie this back into the point from earlier, Data Book 4 makes the statement of Kakashi being a peerless shinobi and one ready to be Hokage. If that further goes on to mention how he saved countless comrades as a first-class teacher and obviously has Hokage level physicals. So, Kakashi being peerless is honestly just consistent concerning a more utility-based perspective, as odd as that may sound, but this doesn't even touch on the monstrosity of Kakashi, as his base gut punches could literally draw blood to the same Obito whose skin didn't even bleed off Naruto's Rasengans. Like, what? And then he can Kamui the full 8 Tails and continues to battle Obito alongside Naruto for several chapters until Obito engages Kakashi and tries to rid him from the battlefield via Kamuing him. But a really sharp and yet overlooked detail is that Obito uses the absorption on Kakashi's 9 Tails cloak. And this is for really the only time in the series, and likely for no other reason than the fact that he doesn't want to engage an amped Kakashi. And as the Ten Tails power is being used for the despoliation of the entire world, Kakashi and Obito's illusory tricks are over, showing Madara matching Obito's full 9 Tails EMS Madara level Genjutsu, and the two then soar at each other, and Kakashi parries Obito onto the back foot, forcing a fireball jutsu to which Kakashi evades it, clashing with Obito's Renegon Rod just to use a basic kunai, wherein Kakashi engages him once again, outpacing him and kicking him onto an immediate follow-up strike with his once downed friend. Although, admittedly, Obito does get up and match Kakashi. Many people have taken Obito's later remarks of him having Kakashi destroy the heart seal as some sort of means to posit that, well, he wasn't trying or something, but that just doesn't link up, and the former position is almost untenable. An equally possible and honestly more probable explanation as it is that he, was just pursuing Kakashi as someone he knew was strong enough to do that and wouldn't be just using Bijou bombs and chakra hands to do that. Kakashi through this should then be concluded to be nearly equal to Obito in terms of raw speed and combat prowess, with the only preface being that Obito couldn't phase, although that doesn't hinder the speed at which he's matching Kakashi, just Obito's own fighting style. That's really it. So to finally hammer home such a notion of why Kakashi isn't the foremost shinobi alive on the battlefield right now, At least concerning serious roles like being Hokage, there's really no reason at all. Even Data Book 3, referring to a Kakuzu fight Kakashi, says he's beyond the ideal shinobi, so now having perfected basically everything he would have used in that fight, you can see the combative acumen of Kakashi, the copy ninja. And to conclude with two minor details, the first of which is on his intelligence, and the back of volume 63 states that Naruto finds a way around Tobi's abilities, although the original Japanese states that while Naruto and the others found a way to defeat the masked man, Kakashi sees through the abilities, realizing the man's technique has the same nature as Kamui. And the latter would just be a bit more about his diversity. I just want to kind of reiterate, and it's the fact that he does still have the evil sealing method according to Data Book 4 that he previously used on Sasuke, which is a natural match for, the tetragram seal, which is called, it's kind of praised as practically the highest level sealing in the world by both Orochimaru and Hiruzen, so Kakashi is, if you couldn't tell, stupidly diverse. However, as the arduous conflict insists, Kakashi still remains relevant, fighting against a Ten Tails Madara, helping with Might Guy's 8th Gate combo attacks, although prior was previously relative to Hokage Minato, fighting persistently, this being the same Hokage Minato that outsped all 4 Hokage to the battlefield, and is stated to not just have body flicker above Tobirama's, but striking speed 2, implying a conjunction of the two speeds. We have no real metric of knowing how they were fighting alongside one another, but just that one was using a Rasengan, the other a Raikiri, and were persistent, according to Black Zetsu. However, this wouldn't be the only comrade he'd begin to fight with. Kakashi would stand firm next to his once dear friend for one final mission. Obito decides to reclaim his identity. He isn't Madara Uchiha. He isn't the masked man. Names aren't irrelevant. He is Obito Uchiha, Kakashi's friend, and he walks ahead of his comrades, giving his life for the hope of a better future, although not before instilling a certain power inside of his dear friend. Opening with DMS Kakashi, the information and more specifically the arguments surrounding this Kakashi are by far the most polarizing for how little material we actually get to cover here. As we see that having gotten previously Obito's 6 paths chakra, it immediately manifests into a Susanoo, which he uses to swipe up Sakura from Kaguya's chakra hands as they were getting closer on her tail. Kakashi then, whilst in the air, flew down at Kaguya with the same Susanoo, then dived off the Susanoo while also activating a Raikiri to then blitz and slice Kaguya. Now, while of course this is a heavily speed amped Kakashi, it's still Kakashi, something I point out in my Sasuke versus Kakashi video here, yet the primary argument is that you have to contend with is nothing really to do with Kakashi, but rather Kaguya and her power, which is stated in the instance prior to be exponentially greater than it was before, which could mean that Kakashi is most certainly above the prior Kaguya. And what Kaguya this is using as the initial referent though? We don't exactly know. It could be the beginning of the battle, fresh Kaguya, or a drained Kaguya. It's not exactly clear. Now, while I do think the arguments can be made in favor of it being a more drained Kaguya with the context of that Kaguya still being a pretty monstrous fighter, I suppose you can argue that since Sasuke and his Susanoo could tangle with her just prior and was beaten up pretty bad in the opening of the fight, she would thus be significantly fatigued or her power has sunk to a lower tier of fighter. It's kind of, regardless, the fatigued one is still of the tier of both Six Paths Naruto and Sasuke, who have said to have gotten the greatest powers in the 15th anniversary guide, also speaking to the sheer amp of the dual MS and how Kakashi can now fight a version of Kaguya above that. Regardless, for Kakashi's benefit, we do still know that Kamui is near a speed tier above himself, and thus he could beat Naruto or Sasuke with Kamui at least a few times out of 10, even if you're gonna be disingenuous. Considering the birthday column remarks that the Kamui is what he used to create openings for his students, after noting that Kakashi had overwhelmed Kaguya in that previous instance, and further demonstrating those higher assertions for the copy ninja. He also has the phasing ability, which for Obito allowed for him to fight characters that were innately faster than himself, like KCM2 Naruto, and more specifically his chakra arms. Although he would go on to lose his Sharingan, but not himself, because what made Kakashi, well, Kakashi wasn't the Sharingan, it was everything else. Kakashi becomes a Hokage about a year after the war, but is reluctant to actually accept the position, in stating in response to if he's still wanting and confident in upholding the role that, at the time, I still had the Sharingan eye, but losing the Sharingan means I lost the Raikiri, which he later argues that those two were his primary abilities that made him confident in his own ability. Although now, he's not really sure. For Kakashi, at least through the middle and to the latter half of the war, the Raikiri should at least be a technique above the third Raikage's Hell Stab, which is not only said to be like Kakashi's Raikiri, but is also an attack called the Greatest Spear, which of course is in context to prior to Kakashi arriving at the Jinchuriki battlefield. The Raikiri for Kakashi is pretty handily a monstrous technique. Kakashi has now begun to acclimate to his situation and further prove to himself, and not just himself, but really those around him, that those two set abilities aren't necessary. Now having created the Purple Lightning, which could draw a complete surprise from the third Tsuchikage Oniki, who had just fought Madara's perfect Susanoo some time ago, and even witnessed the further aspects of the war. Kakashi did this through gushing lightning out of his entire body, shooting it into the sky at all directions, right after it had literally split the clouds, furthering the relation to the previous Kage. Kakashi could essentially also blitz Kaio, who quite literally could perception blitz the fourth Raikage, all just constantly pushing the notions of Kakashi standing far and wide above the rest of the shinobi world, which is exactly what we know elsewhere in the novels, that Kakashi had significantly improved since when he had fought Madara and Obito, where now, after having created several new jutsu to compensate for the loss of not just the Sharingan but the Raikiri, his chakra had, quote, multiplied to a level beyond recognition, possibly alluding to his own remarks that could imply that he could take down Kido, a character capable of fighting and pushing the same adult Sakura, comparable to a fatigued adult Rinnegan Sasuke in the Scarlet Springs one-shot, with Kido himself even calling Kakashi a serious opponent who he can't let his guard down against. However, for Kakashi, if you could actually believe it, this isn't even remotely close to his highest possible assertions. Within the Boruto anime, Kashin Koji is attempting to steal a scroll within the confines of Konoha, wherein Kakashi shows up and can literally box around and forces Koji to, retreat, forcing the concession of him not expecting to have such a risk for such a single scroll. This being the same Koji who is not just declared as one of the Otsutsuki level threats according to Sasuke, further confirming how Koji could at least perform well to the same Jigen that could destroy both Naruto and Sasuke. However, rudimentary skepticism is warranted here, although the conclusions still stand elsewhere, with Koji being confident taking down the same Delta, who was highly relative to adult Naruto's taijutsu strikes that weren't as drained as when they were beating the brakes off the same Momoshiki that terrorized Kaguya into wanting a 1,000-man army to even have a chance. However, this isn't really inconsistent with Kakashi Retsuden taking place just after Sasuke's star pupil novel, despite the cover saying that Kakashi is the greatest and strongest teacher, possibly implying that Kakashi is greater than adult Sasuke in some regard, although that's if you're going to go with that interpretation. All in all, Kakashi is a character whose power has always been a primary point of discussions, though filled with misconceptions. I mean, Kishimoto literally stated in the first anime profile guides that if he would have ever chosen another main character, it would have been Kakashi. So, what did you guys think? Was he stronger than you thought initially? If you learned something, then be sure to subscribe, as it would be greatly appreciated, or simply check out my other versions of these really intricate, long-form analysis of both Sasuke and Naruto, which I've already done, but more importantly, who else would you want to see? And may God bless you all. Love you guys.